Welcome, everybody, to the Band of Gamers podcast. This is episode 85, and I am DBQ Hams, joined by Zeus Adamus.
Hey, what's up, everybody?
So it is just the two of us today, just the two of us. We can make it if you try. All right, but Prime is not with us tonight. He's got some other business to attend to, but in Prime's honor, I've got some Lego Dimension figures up above us so that he can be with us in spirit, even if he's not with us in video. So, our topic for tonight, after a week of kind of a slow news week, right? We're coming into that kind of dead news cycle of prepping before E3. We might get a few leaks here as we get into May. So, as things start to trickle out, we're going to have Judges Week and a couple more weeks for E3. But, last week, after some heavy Scorpio news and some ranting and raving by all of us in terms of both some Scorpio speculation and some on again, off again Nintendo train love, we decided to slow things down and take a little bit in terms of the SNES classic rumors. So, today, if you were lucky enough to get up at 2 in the morning and wait outside your local Best Buy as one of the last places that you might be able to find an NES Classic, there are rumors circulating around that an SNES Classic will be released this holiday season, which makes sense that Nintendo dubbed it a classic line. So, with the Mini Famicom out in Japan and potentially canceled again or at least postponed, and the NES Classic that has captured a lot of fistfights and rumors, and in terms of high-priced eBay sales because of its low production runs. So Nintendo is teasing us all again with an SNES Classic, and I'm sure that production runs will be limited as well. But we're going to take a little bit of time today to pull back and think about what titles might be on there, and not just the speculation of what are those greatest hits, but let's dive deep. We're older, we're mature enough to remember a time of a 16-bit era, of some console wars even. So we're going to dive back, and instead of starting with the SNES, we're going to start with the Genesis. There have been plenty of bits and pieces of mall shop Genesis retro machines out there, but what are some of those classic titles that have stuck with us? And they're not maybe not Sonic, maybe not Streets of Rage. What are those titles that have a lasting memory for us? So we're going to start there. But first, Zeus, I have a question. Did you own an NES, an SNES, or a Genesis?
So I was a Genesis kid, and I guess I mean, kind of what I want to talk about too with a little bit of this topic was kind of like, and we've kind of had some like, what kind of gamer are you shows before, right? But um, you know, for me, and I reckon for you, and maybe a lot of other people who started gaming in this time, like this really started formulating like who I was gonna be to a certain extent, right? I mean, it was the time in my life where I was starting to make choices of my own, and starting to like buy my own stuff, right? So it was a big decision, right, to pick whether or not I was gonna go Genesis or Super NES, at the time, because this was my second console, that I had ever like bought with my own money. The first had been the Sega Master System. Um, and again, so granted, it wasn't the first console, but it was still, it's a big decision, right? When you go around to your second one, do you go with what you know, or do you go with the thing that seems like it's going to be popular and everyone else is buying, um, or stick out on your own? And so I did wind up going with a Genesis. So and I guess for me, even with the NES, the time, that generation, I just didn't find the games on the NES, as appealing to me. As the Sega library just kind of fit more with where I was from a gaming perspective, and I guess, I know a lot of people don't like these terms, but I'm going to continue to use them. it there were more kind of actiony titles to me on that platform, racing titles, whereas I was not as big into RPGs at the time. And then Nintendo felt, I felt like the sports titles on the Genesis were more advanced, and then Nintendo felt like the platformer JRPG console. So, what about you, man? What did you? I mean, were you into gaming at this time, or?
Yeah, so I definitely was. I mean, my first console, I had a hand-me-down VIC-20, and the first console that I owned myself that I purchased with some summer uh, work money was the NES. And I can remember very distinctly. I can remember thinking about saving up for the next generation of consoles for that 16-bit era, and I still own the computer gaming and or video gaming computer gaming magazine issue with both the Genesis figure and a TurboGrafx figure fighting it out, in the holiday of 1989, right, as things were getting released. And I also have a very distinct memory of standing in an electronics aisle with money in my pocket and a Genesis box and debating if I was going to buy it or wait another year for the SNES. And you're exactly right, Zeus. That the games that I remember for the Genesis. I had friends that had a Genesis. Saturday mornings would be somebody bringing it over to somebody else's house to play. It was a lot of sports games, and it was a lot of Sega in that console generation really nailed that arcade conversion, right? That there were a ton of games that were out in the arcades that had, that same type of action and momentum, and Sega captured that. And so, yeah, that makes complete sense that was, if that was the type of gamer you were, that was what you were looking for. I stood in the aisle and ready to buy the Sonic the Hedgehog pack-in. So this was after Ultra Beast, right? Ultra Beast was the original pack-in, and then Sonic came out, and I thought, okay, this is it. I'm gonna get this, and it's the new hotness. And I waited, and I can remember distinctly waiting another year to buy the Super Nintendo. But I will say that the one game that I purchased with the Super Nintendo when I bought it was PGA Golf, a very non-Nintendo y game, but it was very much a reflection of that was a game that I loved on the Genesis. And it was that first time where you had like the pseudo 3D rise and fall of the greens, and it was something where it could play with my friends, and so that was definitely shaped some of my gaming pieces there in terms of being. I look back in this generation, and it was a lot of sports games that I played on both consoles. So Zeus, since you had a Genesis, and we're talking about being, choosing some of those titles, what were some of the titles that really stuck out to you, or that cemented your kind of historic decision of picking up that console?
Right. Um, so some of the titles, and I don't actually have them on my list. There was a lot of. I guess I was starting to get that first. I apologize if the microphone scratches here. I'm trying to reposition a little bit. Um, Part of it was legacy, right? And again, this was my third console. The second one, wait, no, this was my fourth console. Um, Second one I bought with my own money, and so I was coming from the Master System, where um, again a lot of the Genesis to me was just like you mentioned, was that porting of arcade titles that I was chunking quarters into. Um, so so I've had Afterburner on the original Master System, as well as that version of Space Harrier. I was definitely into kind of the legacy titles and continuing to play in franchises that I'd had on the Master System. And man, I really don't know what order to put these in. But so I'm actually going to start with the last game that I recall buying for the Genesis. It was kind of when it was in its twilight. The game may have actually released. It either released after this. It may have released after the Saturn came out, but was Vector Man. And
Yeah, that was toward the end of the console. Yep.
yeah, yeah, and one of the first titles that I can remember cementing in my mind this fact that it is in the final waning months of a console, definitely the last 12 months, that you sometimes see the most technologically advanced games on a given system. And Vector Man was just gorgeous. It sounded wonderful because, of course, one of the Genesis's big claims to fame was the audio processing chip that it had, which which I believe, I may be, this might be revisionist history, but as far as I remember, one of the big commentaries during the console wars was that its audio processing chip was better than the SNES's. Um, but it sounded wonderfully and played beautifully. It was one of the things that played wonderfully with that that 6 button, I think it was ABC XYZ controller, that was
Yep.
very unique to that system, um, and just a wonderful game of fluidity. I still kind of didn't like platformers, but back then, um, I would play them. And Vector Man was kind of this weird mix of a platformer, actiony, 2D side scroller game that where the action was very unique. It wasn't like Contra. It wasn't like some of the other games that we played back then. But but that's one of the ones that sticks out. It also profoundly sticks out of my head because, of course, I set the pattern at that time of this notion that when the new console came out, right, I would take the current console or the old console and take it to GameSpot, right, or EB Games or Babbage's or Software Boutique or whatever it was at the time, and trade the console in to get the next thing. And I think when I went to buy my Sega Saturn, it was Babbage's at the time. Um, so I can remember like regretting that I'd had such little time with Vector Man. But of course, the Sega Saturn was not backwards compatible. We were making the leap from cartridges to CD games, and I regrettably turned that in. So if I ever do go back and buy like a Genesis, it will predominantly be because I want to play some more Vector Man. So what about you? What was one of your like one of your Super NES nostalgic titles that you remember from that generation?
So I will say that I think that one of them, thinking about sports games, one of them, certainly there were a lot of platformers. And I also this would have put me probably somewhere in high school at the time of a good chunk of the 16-bit wars. And the Genesis was the cooler console. It had the action era games, and this is even before you get into the blood of Mortal Kombat. That it had more sports titles. It had the arcade games. It wasn't the slow paced. I can remember those commercials of Mario kind of plodding along and Sonic zipping past him, right? That back and forth cutting of the marketing out of the Genesis. But on the Nintendo side, I did still end up playing some kind of oddball titles as well. And so this was a time when I was working at retail as a part-time job. And so I remember a game, Una Racers, where you played. It was kind of like a stunt racing game, but you were basically a free rolling unicycle that you were doing tricks and through courses and speed runs. And so it had some of that aspect of mode 7 and lots of colorful pieces. The sound chip on the Super Nintendo was a Sony sound chip, I believe, and so that was a pretty good sound there as well once it got up and running. Both on the Genesis, it had the ability to be programmed well for sound, but the Super Nintendo had a good sound chip there again as well. So yeah, I think Uniracers was one of them. Another game. Thinking about sports games, still uh, there was this title. So Super Play Action Football, which was a Play Action Football, was a Nintendo produced football game. It was back on the NES, and you could play 4 people. The graphics were terrible. It was kind of a top-down view, but the odd piece of it was that the screen went at a diagonal, and so you were always kind of running at a diagonal. I don't know the logic behind it, and if it was to kind of give you more real estate as you were being able to see the field, or if it was simply just something to distinguish it. But this title I played a whole bunch with friends and family, and mainly because it was a slow plotting football game, but it had high school football, it had college football, and it had pro teams. So it didn't have licensed players, but it had licensed teams. It had cities for colleges, and so you had different playbooks at a college level. You had more options, a run option and more mobile quarterbacks versus the pros. And then as being somebody in high school, you could create your own high school teams and name them and give them colors. So it kind of became a little bit of wish fulfillment as well, right? So again, not a super great game. But it'd be interesting to see if that makes it onto the NES Classic, because it doesn't have to really license anything. So that's definitely one of the ones that I'm thinking about in terms of those. But on the Genesis side, I think, as you were talking about arcade games, I can remember being a non-Genesis owner and being so jealous of Strider, right? I mean, this was the first, what, 6 MB cartridge or 8 MB cartridge. It was hyped up, and the sprites were, I mean, it's still beautiful sprite work. I mean, it is a faithful arcade port and translation. And being a Nintendo owner and getting this kind of Metroid-like Capcom version of Strider that didn't play anything like this beautiful arcade game. So there are lots of games out there on the Genesis that evoked some jealousy from me as well. So do you have any other titles, Zeus, that would make me jealous? Things that you were remembering?
Yeah, it's my Sega Genesis ownership was kind of weird because I can't remember exactly how I went down, but I went and I think what I wound up doing was I bought this. So I graduated from high school and did a year at prep school, and then went to college. And the college I went to, like, you couldn't have the prep school I went to. I could have like a video game console, but I could only play it like on weekends, and I had to go to the rec room where there was a TV, and there's this whole process. But I wound up, so I bought my Genesis, came back home during a break, took it back with me to prep school, played it there on the weekends for a year. But then when I went to college, like I wound up getting rid of it because I was like, I can't play this at college. Um, and then when I graduated college, I went and like bought it again. So I think I bought a Genesis like 3 times. So so I bought it again like in the first summer after I was out of college when I bought my moved into my first place. Played it. I briefly got enamored with the Atari Jaguar. So I took my Sega.
The Jaguar with its like 8 button,
Yes,
ColecoVision
yeah,
controller.
yeah,
Oh
it's,
yeah.
it was awesome. Um, and in that second iteration, I had the 32X, um, and I can remember that experience because I went very late at night. Um, I actually went to a local mall, uh, and the local mall had the 32X, but didn't have any 32X games. So I
I don't know that anybody had any 32X games, right? I still own a retailer like sell through book of 32X, like a distributor kind of
right,
promotional material. And I think
right,
there's like 8 titles in there. I mean,
yeah,
but there was a racing game, right? There was
yep,
X-Wing. There were a couple good ones there.
yeah. Yeah, so I went after work and bought the 32X. There were no games there. I was highly disappointed. I was like, man, do I get the 32X here because I know they have it, um, or do I just bounce into this other place where hopefully they'll have the 32X game? So I bought the 32X there, and I went to, man, this little town that was like in between where I lived in Providence, Rhode Island. Um, but it was like a 45-minute drive, right? It was dark. It was in the winter, and I bought the Star Wars title, and then drove all the way back home and like immediately plugged this thing in and played it. Um, but uh, but that was just a little bit of my ownership experience. And then after the Jaguar, I went back and bought. I traded that in because I didn't like it after 4 or 5 months. Bought a Genesis again. Had that for like 3 months, and then the Saturn was out. But anyway, one of probably the biggest game for me, and I had other titles on this list, but I had to put Eternal Champions on there. And I don't know how many people know about this title, but
This
it
was
was
a fighting game, right?
this was a fighting game, very weird, and I think it was based on another property. I think there was like a really like not very well known like comic book or something that it was associated with, but
It has that kind of like late 80s hard metal sci-fi or fantasy look to it, almost like a heavy metal art style.
yeah, and one of the guy I can't remember all the characters' names, but the main character I remember he was an African American guy, had a bunch of weapons and gadgets and stuff, and I want to say at the time he was based on like the Blade character, or maybe the look of Blade eventually became based on this guy. I'm not sure which way it goes in pop culture, um, but so I had tried Mortal Kombat. A lot of the story of my home console ownership is about how I was horrible at arcade games, and the main reason I bought home consoles was to get better at games, or at least to play games like out of the public's eye. Um, but I was horrible at Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter and all those games. I just didn't get them. Much in the same way that in later decades, I would just not get like real time strategy games. Like I just had a hard time getting my head around the concept. I didn't get fighting games, but Eternal Champions for me was one of those very first early kind of weapons based games. In my mind, kind of a spiritual ancestor to Soul Calibur, which again, like I struggle to get into Street Fighter, but I love Soul Calibur because it's weapons based. Um, and like Tekken, it took me a long time to get a hold of that, but this was I was about done with fighting games. I was just like, I'm not ever buying another fighting game again. Like I'm out. Um, but but through playing this game and just working at it and working at it and working at it, like I started to like crack the code on not necessarily getting better at them, but coming around to them being enjoyable. Um, and I owe that all to Eternal Champions. And my last one I have on this list is and this was a 32x game. I had Star Wars on the list for a while, but um, Star Wars Star Wars 32x was just kind of it was a game you had to buy. But the game I really remember that was a 32x game was Pitfall: The Mayan Adventure. Uh, and it's because when I was a kid growing up, I got a Magnavox Odyssey 2 was my Generation 2 console because they were sold in my dad's company store, and so that's what he bought us. And I'm very 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 happy that was my second generation console. But one of the things that I missed out on was other kids had Pitfall, and they had the Atari 2600 and the 5200 and the 7800. Um, and I never got a chance to play Pitfall, but and again, here was one of these early wonders of video games, right? That when we talk about this today, how I just mentioned it last week when I took the position of let's not discount remakes and things that come out on other consoles, because a lot of times people didn't own the console that game was out on, and now it's licensed for play on a different console. So this was kind of my first major instance experiencing that. I just hadn't gotten a chance to have Pitfall Harry on one of my consoles, and this was actually Pitfall Harry Jr. But technologically, it was amazing. It was like it wasn't sprite based. It was actually a 2D. I don't know what you want to call it. Image on the screen, like an actual graphic that didn't just look like some nondescript sprite based um, you know 2D character or whatever. So and it played amazingly smoothly. The swinging from vines. I just loved how his mobility and his kinematics were not just these little herky jerky like 2-bit moves. It was really fluid in a lot of ways that characters move today in a 3D plane. Um, so and the key thing I remember is every time I booted that game up, right, and played a level, it was just something different. Pretty amazing level design, I would say, for the time.
Yeah, I can remember that game just by the sprite work. I mean, not maybe not sprites, but just the graphics. The
Right,
character
right.
was pretty big on the screen.
Yeah.
But I remember it for the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. So, do you remember if there was any difference between the Genesis version versus the 3DX version? And I even looked this up today. There was a Sega CD version of it as well, so it came out on a ton of stuff.
Right. No, I don't specifically remember that. And I bought I didn't buy the 32X out of the gate. It was kind of one of those things that I kind of slept on and I let it linger. And then finally I was like, I may as well get the thing. I never did plunk down for a Sega CD though. But what about you, then? Any other Super NES games that you were into?
Oh yeah, but see, now you mentioned the Sega CD, and my cousin had that, right? So I owned the Super Nintendo, and my cousin who lived on the other end of town owned the Sega, the Genesis, and the Sega CD, right? And so we'd swap weekends at each other's house and stay up late playing games. Yeah, so no, I don't even remember what he even had for the Sega CD, other than like Sewer Shark because it came with it. But
Yeah, and the only titles I remember from that at all were Eco the Dolphin, and there was a Sonic game that was on the Sega CD.
yep, Sonic CD, which has
Yep.
then since been remastered and put out on mobile and other places.
Right.
No, right, and even the whole Night Trap and Sewer Shark pieces of the Sega CD are old Laserdisc games from the mid '80s that had been sitting around in a warehouse for quite a while and were repurposed to get it out the door. So I guess the last game that I'm gonna kind of throw out there, thinking about potential, SNES classic consoles. So as I was working at retail during this time and seeing lots of banners and posters of things, there was I, for all the hype and praise that the Legend of Zelda Link to the Past gets, right, and a solid game, but I enjoyed it. I never really, I got to the Dark World in it, and yeah, I was okay. It wasn't until decades later when I came back to it. But there was another game that was getting kind of some hype in terms of like a Zelda-like game called The Illusion of Gaia, and I can remember the packaging of it, that it came with its own T-shirt. This was the mid '90s, and it was a black T-shirt. Who doesn't want that? Granted, it was like this Japanese action RPG type of game that it has more in it has more in common with the very uncool game like Star Tropics than it does with a Link to the Past. But so that's a game that I remember. I remember like forcing myself to try to like it. Like I bought it, I spent this $60 or $70 because cartridges were not cheap, and I figured, okay, well, this is the one game I purchased before it was in between, birthdays and holidays. And I tried and tried so hard to get into it, and I did eventually enjoy it. But it was one of those where if it wasn't for kind of feeling obliged to like that, right? Like, at what point do you turn away from a game? We've had that conversation about modern games as well, but that was one of the games that I think is a little lesser known and solidly designed, but doesn't. I don't even know that it ever got even a virtual console release back in the Wii days. So that's kind of why I put it up on that list. Is it's a game I remember relatively fondly, kind of some mixed emotions, but something that hasn't seen the light of day in a while either. So the one thing I do want to go back to, if you don't have any other titles, is the parallel between your 3DX shopping story and your Nintendo Switch shopping story, right? That you're hopping from store to store, buying a game here at this one store and the console at another one. It's your shopping habits have not drastically changed as you've matured there, Zeus.
Well, it's an interesting parallel, right? Because I guess maybe the Switch, the the launch of the Switch kind of harkened back to that oldie time, right? Where and it wasn't just that generation for the 32X. It was kind of one iteration of it. So there was that. Um, you know, it was back when at the time when things were locked in brick and mortar and retail, right? I can remember for the Sega Saturn for Generation 5 going to Babbage's with the full intent to buy a PlayStation. So I was going to drop Sega for the first time ever, and I got into Babbage's, and they didn't have the box set that I wanted for the PlayStation. They had the PlayStation that came with Killer Instinct, and I didn't want that. Um, and it was Killer Instinct in one controller, and
Are you sure it's Killer Instinct? I thought that was
no,
a rare. That was a
Battle
that.
Arena Toshinden.
There we go. Yep,
That's
that sounds right. Because that Killer Instinct was the Super Nintendo kind of version of, look, we can do this too.
Right. So it was Battle Arena Toshinden and one controller, and money wise, I really insist. And there was a different bundle that had it had two controllers and no game. And I was like, so if I get this bundle and I don't want Battle Arena Toshinden, I'm gonna have to buy a second controller and buy another game. And budget wise, I was kind of locked into just I could afford like the console if it had the second controller and two games, and I was like, this is going to eat into one of my games, and I wound up buying the Sega Saturn instead. Um, and then we all went through that whole chase with the PlayStation 2, which was incredibly difficult to source and buy. At the very beginning of the internet, sales era. So it was, I went through a lot of that, and the Switch kind of pushed us back to that with a supply that was limited not only in hardware but also in software titles. Um, there were problems with the store in the launch window. So yeah, it was very similar. So thankfully, those of us of the old guard went through that a lot because because I literally, as I read stories on the internet, like it was kind of clear to me that other gamers, younger gamers, like haven't been through that and like didn't know how to deal. Like there were people who just didn't get Zelda that launch weekend, right? Because they couldn't find it in a store and they couldn't order it online. Um, so yeah. So one thing I do want to mention before we shift over is so one of the things that inspired me to pitch this as a uh, topic for tonight is I also wrote. Uh, I don't know if this is showing on the screen now, but I wrote this article over the weekend, which was a case against the Super NES being declared the greatest console of all time. And there was a lot kind of swirling around with these Super NES rumors, and that drove me to pitch this as a conversation topic, and also to write this article, which has kind of been brewing in my head for a long time. And um, and it's and yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, yeah, give me the sales pitch of it. So, I will actually read the article because I'm really curious, and as somebody who can look back with a kind of a critical eye, I think there's a case to be made that it's, there's a lot of rose tinted glasses there.
Yeah, and that's mainly what kind of the write up is about. From my perspective, it's what I didn't do is I did not write the article as an argument for what console should be considered the greatest of all time. The article is because I feel like you could definitely be accused of fanboyism and whatever, and it can become a war. I do have my opinions on what the greatest console of all time is, but it's mainly because I have heard that. Uh, that opinion be rendered about a half dozen times in the last year between podcasts I listened to, other staff writers that I worked with at Geeks Worldwide, um, and a few other places in writing. And each time I'm like, okay, based on what? Like, what's your criteria? And predominantly what I get a lot of the time is a lot of nostalgia. Like, well, it was the console that initially got me into gaming, or it was the console my older brother owned, and like I would sneak in and play it like when he wasn't there, or but but not really based on any kind of like business case analysis. And a lot of kind of to sum the article up, uh, most of it centers around this notion that my argument is that when you look at what the Super Nintendo had to do in comparison to other console generations, it really didn't have to do much, right? It was really a two console war in this generation. It was just it in the Genesis. The Neo Geo, if I have these right, the Neo Geo was ridiculously priced.
Yeah, it was $600 some. Yeah, it
Right,
was priced itself out of the market, and the PC Engine or the TurboGrafx here in America, by the time it released in America, it was a dated graphical engine. It was just a hybrid 8-bit piece, so it really was a two console race.
right. Two console race consoles didn't do a lot back then. They didn't have to have internet-based services wrapped around them. There was no online gaming, um, and there weren't as many complex variables in that market space as there were in generations 5, 6, 7, and 8. So, that's mainly what the article is about. Is if if you claim that the Super NES was the greatest console ever, my challenge is, tell me what quantifiable criteria that's based on. And then I kind of wrap it up by saying, look, if it's your favorite console of all time, I think that's a statement that can be made. No one can really argue with you about that, right? But if you're going to proclaim, particularly if you're a professional writer, right? If you're somebody who gets paid to do what you and I are doing for free, right? Um, then please quantify and justify, your statement. And I also feel like the statement has to be some justification beyond, the size of its library, or it had the largest volume of highest quality games ever released. I mean, that's highly subjective too, right? Like, that depends if all those types of games appeal to you. Um, so yeah, so there we go.
So Zeus, I think you've given us our topic for next week because I think that right. I think one, I'm going to read your article, and I
Okay.
think that anybody listening and watching this should as well. I think your opinions are always well researched and reflective, and not super emotional or tinted with the fanboyism. So I would love to come back to this topic next week and talk about what we think actually is the greatest console of all time. And just off the cuff, I have a couple thoughts, but again, the idea of being able to quantify it, and whether it's, is that criteria simply just volume of sales? Is it a significance in the marketplace that it did something that moved things forward or transformed the marketplace? So it'll be interesting. So let's table that and come back to it for next week.
Absolutely.
So no, I was definitely on board with talking about this. Last week was very much a retro game week in terms of
Mm-hmm.
game releases. We had Voodoo Vince came back out, the remaster of it, which is the original Xbox platformer kind of game, puzzle platformer. We also had, speaking of Sega, we had Wonder Boy 3, right? The remaster that came out, which was at the tail end of the Master System. So, did you have Wonder Boy? Were you any of those platformers, those Alex Kidd, Wonder Boy, Adventure Island type of games?
I absolutely did on the Master System. Yeah.
Yep. And so this one, if I haven't had a chance to check it out yet, but I'm actually going to look for it on the Switch because one, it'll be something to play, but it's a neat kind of remaster of kind of hand-drawn animation, but then you can switch back to the 8-bit animation back and forth as well. And then the other retro game that actually I picked up and have been playing a chunk of with my kids is the Disney Afternoon collection, right? So
Okay.
there's DuckTales and Rescue Rangers and DuckTales 2 and Rescue Rangers 2 and Darkwing Duck, which plays out kind of like a little slower paced Mega Man. Um, Played some DuckTales, watched my kids play some DuckTales 2. My son and I played some Rescue Rangers. I can remember playing through that. And it's been kind of fun to feel good at a game compared to my kids a little bit, right? Like I'm nailing these jumps. I know when things are going to come. Even the simple mechanics of if you go too far on the screen and you try to go back, that thing you killed is going to come back. It's going to respawn and watch out. So, but that collection does have a nice rewind feature so that you can continue to rewind as you miss a jump or miss a throw or get killed by an enemy. So that I've been playing a lot of that, and then just a little bit. Well, not a lot more of some Destiny, trying to close out some last pieces there of your original Destiny. So those are what I've been playing, Zeus. But I think you've got a little more diverse mix than I do for this past week. So, what's on your gameplay list?
So yeah, and there's so many games on my list just because. So I spent the last week, and usually kind of my setup is I try and play on two different gaming systems. One in the first half of the week and one in the second. And I wound up spending both halves of last week playing on my NVIDIA Shield TV Pro model. So that's the 500 gigabyte unit. And games on that system predominantly are kind of shorter in terms of attention span. Although there are some very long games. Half-Life 2 is on that system, which I often boot that system up and play Half-Life 2 for a couple of hours. Um, so in the first half of last week, I played, and I bought new games last week too. So um, two of the games that I bought last week were Zombie Age 2 and IndyCar Racing 500. Um, Unfortunately, I don't have. There's gameplay video of Zombie Age 2 on my YouTube channel, Rounding Off Infinity, and I'll be editing some video and putting it up of IndyCar Racing 500 as well. But Zombie Age 2 is kind of the side-scrolling 2D zombie shooter that isn't all that technically impressive, but one of the things it does, it's a wonderful design in terms of um, one of the things the implementation does is it definitely gives you that Walking Dead feel where every time I'm watching The Walking Dead, and I'm a huge Walking Dead fan. I haven't watched the last few episodes of season 7 yet, um, but I have been a staunch fan and have watched all the seasons up till then. And one of the things that when you're looking at it, uh, I was initially provoked to feel, and I feel like anybody who's watching it cold is provoked to feel like, why are these zombies like such a problem for these guys? Like clearly you can outrun them, right? But the zombies on The Walking Dead have this weird thing of despite the fact that their bodies appear very not very resilient, but when they fall on you, they have this incredible weight that people seem to struggle to get them off. Um, but then also it's the numbers that get to you, right? That um, while there may be a traversable path to get through a crowd of them, if any one of those paths gets closed down, um, then it's kind of curtains for you. And that's what Zombie Age 2 kind of feels like. You're on the screen, they feel like they're shambling towards you. You feel like you're just 3 steps faster than them. But if they close down any of those escape routes, it's a problem. And they when they are get within biting range of you, they can bite very quickly, and they can be very difficult to get off. And you have ranged weapons, so I've gotten a pistol and a submachine gun and a shotgun to this point. Um, but there are certain tactical situations you get into where it is actually better to go melee, because that kind of pushes them off you a little more and gives you a little more maneuvering space. So, um, so that was a pretty interesting title. And then IndyCar Racing 500, also pretty interesting in terms of just a pretty advanced physics model. Again, for a game that's essentially an Android game, even though the Shield Pro TV is a very powerful console. There's one issue with physics when you're racing on an oval where it hits this weird kind of tip over point where then the car is kind of sliding sideways down the track, and I'm like, I wouldn't expect oversteer to be modeled that aggressively in an IndyCar title, but it may have something to do with me needing to tune my controller. I'm not sure, but from there it kind of went on to be kind of a racing weekend for me, as I wanted to stick with that genre as we headed into the weekend. So I played a little Monkey Racing and some Reckless Racing 3, and Repulse, which was a title that I bought like when that console first released. I had never gotten around to playing. Repulse is a little different because it's very tactical in terms of the objectives that you have to complete on each track, and they differ by each track, and you're not on the track with other racers, so it's entirely a matter of kind of racing the track a time or two and figuring out like where are the speed boosters and mastering each of the specific turns, and getting it to a point where you can get the time down below the threshold you need to. But probably the most interesting thing that I played out of those racing titles is a relatively new title, Riptide GP Renegade. And Riptide and Riptide GP have been 2 games by Velocity or Vector, or I can't remember exactly the name of the developer, but they've been on mobile like since the original iPad came out. And
Are those almost Wipeout like, if I'm trying to remember correctly, or are they more
like Hydro Thunder.
Hydra? Yep. Okay.
Yeah,
Yep.
so it's
Yep.
kind of a wave runner jet ski kind of racing game. Riptide GP Renegade kind of as many racing games do, they kind of rip the notion of a real world physics kind of off, and it's set like in the future, and they try and do kind of like this little story stuff about it. It's about the fidelity of like some of the Need for Speed, like Pro Street, like where it's just really flimsy dialogue and intermediate scenes in between racetracks. But so the story doesn't really matter. But they introduce some new physics. The stunts get really aggressive. The tracks are amazing, and the big thing with this title is from a technical perspective. Uh, it's the most advanced of the Riptide series, obviously. But when I booted it up, I mean, it's to me, it's like, am I looking at a PlayStation 3 game or PlayStation 4 game? Is this really Android? But it's kind of one of those games that definitely tech demos the capability of that platform, which gives me hopes for the Switch, right? Because it proves that hardware should be able to handle quite a bit. So that is what I've been playing, and like you, for the first half of this week, my intention is to get onto the PlayStation 4 and play some Destiny.
Yeah, nice. So, well, that brings us, kind of wraps up our discussion for this week. We're keeping it short and sweet and giving you something to listen to and reflect back on. So, if you've got some thoughts about what titles we should have talked about, what ones I'm sure we got some factually incorrect things in terms of sound chips and release dates. I'm sure there's some errors that somebody can point out to us in the comments. So, before you run off for another week of Band of Gamers, Zeus, do you have any final closing thoughts, things that you want to pitch before we go?
Not really. Like I said, if you wanna, what I hope is an interesting read, you could head over to gearworks.com, where I posted a few posts over the weekend, mainly questioning whether or not the new Mutants movie is sequenced right in Fox's lineup, but also more so in the gaming space, this notion of the Super NES, and our own Band of Gamers episode number 84. Maybe that's, and I also uh, did a little memory lane walk in written form for the Sega Dreamcast. And that's one thing maybe we should mention with the show. So as of right now, not saying that it's the permanent arrangement, but you can obviously watch the live stream here on YouTube, or you can watch the archive version here on YouTube. If you would like to kind of get alerted or see when the episodes are available, you can subscribe to the RSS feed at gearworks.com. I will bring up the spelling of that one more time. But over there, what we will do is we will post. We'll link to the we'll link to the video version of the episode, so you can watch it right here on the site. But also, there is a SoundCloud. There's the SoundCloud feed is also embedded on this page. So if you want it in audio form, you can go there and listen to it live. There is also a download link right here, because I know I am a long distance commuter, so I like audio podcasts that you can download. So I try to be very particular about ensuring that I always enable the download, so as not to get people bent out of shape. But that is where it will be. And there's also a time index here for you if you're going to listen to it in audio, where if you want to kind of skip to a specific point in the conversation, you can uh, kind of read this table of contents, essentially, if you will, and find a part of the conversation that you specifically want to listen to in the audio feed.
That's excellent. Thank you, Zeus. I think that the ability to have that download and have those timestamps is going to be a really useful piece. Over at GearWorks, that is great. As somebody who is constantly having podcasts with him, whether it's yard work as it was this weekend, or data entry at my place of employment, that there is always time for some good podcasts and some conversation. So for those of you that have joined us, I appreciate the time. Feel free to continue to come back week after week, and we'll keep the conversation going both here on the Band of Gamers channel and also over at GearWorks as we continue to provide you with conversation starters, stirring the pot a little bit with controversy as Zeus has this past weekend. So again, feel free to like, share, and subscribe. On behalf of Zeus Adamas and myself, DBQ Hams, thanks again, and we will see you soon.